Long before cities rose from stone and ships sailed across oceans, the concept of work was already embedded in human life. But in those earliest days, jobs were not titles written on parchment or positions within an organization. They were roles carved out by necessity, shaped by the demands of the land, the weather, and survival itself. For the first humans, work was inseparable from life. Every sunrise brought tasks that could not be postponed. Finding food, securing shelter, protecting the group from predators. There was no weekend, no concept of retirement, and certainly no clock to punch. Instead, labor was dictated by the rhythms of nature, the migration of herds, the ripening of fruits, the coming of storms. Some of these roles were instinctive. Skilled hunters emerged from those who had the keenest eyes, the fastest reflexes, and the ability to track prey for days without losing the trail. Gatherers were those who knew which plants healed and which poisoned, who could recognize edible roots from their leaves alone. Toolmakers spent hours shaping stone, bone, and wood into weapons, fishing hooks, and containers. Firekeepers ensured that the precious flame once lit never died, because starting it anew could take hours of effort. These jobs were not chosen. They were earned through skill, strength, memory, and trust. A mistake in your role could mean disaster for the whole group. A poorly tied spearhead might fail during a hunt. A wrongly identified plant might poison a child. Every task carried weight, and those who excelled were valued not for status or wealth, but for their ability to keep the community alive. In many ways, these earliest forms of work shaped the foundation of human cooperation. Hunting required coordination and strategy. Gathering relied on communication and shared knowledge, and even toolmaking was refined through observation and teaching. While the modern workplace is filled with titles, promotions, and career paths, the essence of work contributing to the well-being of a group remains a direct legacy from these ancient beginnings. In the earliest human communities, specialization began as a matter of efficiency rather than ambition. Not everyone could be the best hunter, and not everyone had the patience or the knack for shaping a perfect spear point. Over time, skill differences naturally shaped roles within the group. The best toolmakers focused on crafting. The most agile hunters tracked game. Those with deep knowledge of plants became the gatherers and healers. This was the seed of an economy, not in the sense of coins or markets, but in the quiet exchange of value. A finely crafted spearhead might be traded for a share of meat. A well-tanned hide could earn you help repairing your shelter. No one called it commerce, but the principle was there. You gave what you were best at, and received what you needed in return. Such exchanges often relied on trust rather than formal accounting. In small bands, where everyone knew everyone, reputation was currency. If you failed to deliver on your ends, you accepted a hide but didn't return with promised berries, you might not get another deal. The cost of broken trust could be social isolation, which in the Paleolithic world was as dangerous as hunger. Over time, certain goods became more desirable and widely exchanged beyond a single group. Rare pigments for body painting, shells from distant shores, or flint from a faraway quarry could travel hundreds of miles through a network of trades between groups. This was the faint outline of long-distance trade, one group passing an item to another, each adding value along the way, until it reached someone who valued it enough to keep it. These early exchanges also encouraged innovation. A hunter who received a new type of spear tip from another group might adapt it to local needs. A gatherer who learned of a plant from a traveler could expand the community's diet or medicine chest. In this way, trade didn't just move objects, it moved ideas. By the time humans began to settle more permanently and cultivate land, the groundwork for a true economy was already in place. The principle was simple. Survival was easier when you didn't have to do everything yourself. Specialization and exchange meant more efficient work, better tools, and greater security. And from those first silent trades over the glow of a fire, the concept of value and the systems to manage it began to take root. The earliest trade routes were not marked by roads or guarded by caravans. They were threads of human movement, woven across landscapes by necessity. Hunters following migrating herds might cross paths with gatherers harvesting seasonal plants. Bands that had never met before would exchange a wary glance, a few words in overlapping dialects, and sometimes items that neither side could easily get at home. These encounters could be tense. Strangers meant uncertainty, and uncertainty in the wild could be deadly. But over time, patterns emerged. Certain river crossings, hunting grounds, or sheltered valleys became regular meeting points. Here, people began to expect and even plan for interaction with outsiders. They brought goods to trade, stories to share, and news of what lay beyond the horizon. What moved along these early networks was more than just goods. Knowledge traveled with equal, if not greater, importance. A better way to haft a spear, a plant that could soothe a fever, a technique for weaving fibers into stronger cord. These innovations could leapfrog across hundreds of miles through successive exchanges. Each group adapted what they learned to their own environment, creating regional variations and new inventions altogether. Culture, too, was mobile. Songs, dances, myths, and even spiritual beliefs could shift and blend through these contacts. A carving style from one region might inspire rock art in another. A ritual used to call on hunting luck in the north might evolve into a planting ceremony in the south. With every meeting, pieces of identity moved from one group to another, layering human culture with shared threads. Even conflict had its place in this web. Rivalries over resources sometimes erupted into skirmishes, but even after clashes, survivors often carried back weapons, ornaments, or practices taken from their enemies. Borrowing and adaptation did not require peace, just contact. In this way, the Paleolithic world was more interconnected than it might seem. There were no cities, no written languages, but there was already a quiet network spanning valleys, mountains, and coasts. Through these networks, humanity wasn't just surviving, it was evolving together, one exchange at a time. For tens of thousands of years, human life followed the same seasonal rhythm. Move with the herds, gather what the land offered, and abandon a place once its resources ran dry. But around 12,000 years ago, in scattered pockets of the world, something began to change. People discovered that seeds dropped near their camps would sprout again, and that certain plants could be encouraged, tended, and harvested. This shift was gradual, not a sudden revolution. At first, farming supplemented hunting and gathering. Small patches of wheat, barley, millet, or rice grew near seasonal camps, giving a predictable bonus to the group's food supply. But the advantages were clear. Plants stayed put. You didn't have to chase them across plains or climb cliffs to reach them. The more people planted, the more tempting it became to stay in one place long enough to reap the reward. Settling down came with a price. Farming was not easier than foraging, it was often harder. Fields had to be cleared, seeds sown, weeds pulled, pests driven off, and harvests stored. The work was relentless and tied to the turning of the seasons in a way hunting never was. But the payoff was stability. Grain stores could carry a community through lean months, and herds of domesticated animals offered meat, milk, wool, and muscle power on demand. With permanence came new skills and roles. Someone had to craft sturdier shelters that could withstand years of weather instead of weeks. Pottery emerged to store grain and liquids. Weaving expanded to produce baskets, nets, and cloth. People who no longer needed to hunt every day could specialize. Some became toolmakers full-time, others healers, others traders. Social life also transformed. A settled village meant more people living in closer quarters, and that meant rules. Property, once a meaningless concept among nomads, now mattered. Who owned a field, who inherited it. Hierarchies emerged, with certain families controlling more land or better plots. Wealth, for the first time, could be stored and displayed, not just in tools or jewelry, but in acres and harvests. The agricultural shift didn't just change how people fed themselves, it rewrote the blueprint of society. It tied humans to the land, expanded the scale of cooperation and conflict, and set the stage for everything that would follow: villages, cities, kingdoms, and the first sparks of civilization. Once people began to settle in one place for good, the shape of human society shifted in ways no wandering band could have imagined. A cluster of huts beside a field might start as a small farming community, but over generations it could grow into something entirely new: a permanent settlement, a place with roots in the earth and a rhythm dictated by more than just the migration of animals. With permanence came abundance. A good harvest meant more food than a family could eat in a season. This surplus became a kind of currency stored in granaries, traded for goods from neighboring villages, or offered as tribute to those who could protect it. Trade no longer depended solely on rare materials like obsidian or seashells. Now everyday staples could be exchanged, connecting settlements in a wider web of mutual benefit. Specialization accelerated. In a larger community, not everyone had to farm. Potters, blacksmiths, and weavers could devote themselves to their crafts, producing better tools, sturdier storage vessels, and finer clothing than anyone working part-time could manage. Traders emerged as a distinct role: people who knew the routes, the risks, and the bargaining skills needed to move goods far beyond the horizon. But with stored wealth came something less welcome, the need for protection, and with it, power. At first, this might mean a few skilled hunters standing guard, or a respected elder settling disputes. Over time, those who controlled defense and by extension, the community's safety began to control more than that. Land boundaries were drawn, rules were agreed upon, and soon enforced. Leaders became chiefs, and chiefs' families became the beginnings of an elite class. Inequality grew alongside prosperity. Some homes were larger, built from stronger materials. Some families had more land, more animals, more influence. Those at the top often justified their position with stories of divine favor, ancestral right, or exceptional skill. Religion and governance began to intertwine, with leaders claiming not just authority, but a sacred duty to rule. Permanent settlements also meant permanent conflict. Disputes over land and water could escalate into raids or wars. Walls went up, both to keep enemies out and to display the community's strength. What had begun as a practical choice to plant seeds and stay had evolved into a complex web of cooperation, competition, and control. The village had become something more, a seedbed for civilization itself. As villages swelled into towns and towns began to resemble the first cities, daily life became more than just tending crops and crafting tools. A growing population meant more trade, more disputes, and more complexity in keeping track of it all. Oral agreements, once enough in small bands, began to strain under the weight of larger communities. Memory could be faulty, and in matters of land, harvests, or debt, forgetting was no longer a small inconvenience, it could spark conflict. The solution began humbly. Marks scratched on clay tablets, knots tied in cords, carvings on bone or wood. At first, these were not writing as we think of it, but records counts of grain owed, tallies of animals traded, logs of who had contributed labor to a public work. These simple systems gave rise to accounting, the first language of bureaucracy. In time, symbols became more sophisticated. A mark could stand for a specific commodity, then for a name, then for an idea. In places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, writing blossomed from record-keeping into a tool for administration, religion, and storytelling. But its roots remained in the practical need to manage a society that had grown too large for memory alone. Bureaucracy followed close behind. Someone had to collect the grain owed as tax. Someone had to store it. Someone had to decide how and when it would be distributed. Officials often appointed by or loyal to a ruling elite emerged as a class of their own. Their power came not from the spear or the plow, but from their control over records, rules, and resources. With these systems, large-scale projects became possible. Irrigation canals could be dug and maintained over decades. Temples and public buildings could rise, their construction requiring coordination of hundreds of workers and tons of material. The machinery of administration was the invisible framework holding these early civilizations together, preventing them from collapsing under their own weight. Yet this new order came at a cost. The same records that made fair distribution possible also made unequal distribution enforceable. Taxes could be levied with precision, and debts recorded in a way that bound people to repayment or to servitude. Writing, once born to aid cooperation, could also be a tool of control. Still, without it, the leap from village to city might never have been made. The clay tablet and the reed stylus were as transformative as the plow and the wheel, not because they grew food or moved goods, but because they allowed human societies to think, plan, and rule on a scale that had never existed before. In the earliest civilizations, religion was not a private matter, it was the heartbeat of the community, woven into every harvest, every law, every decision made by its leaders. Temples rose in the centers of towns, towering above homes and workshops. Their size and grandeur, a constant reminder of powers greater than any single human. These sacred spaces were more than places of worship. They were hubs of economic and political life. Grain was stored in temple granaries, offerings were collected and redistributed, and priests often served as record keepers and advisors to rulers. By controlling both the spiritual and material resources of the community, religious authorities became indispensable. Monuments took this influence to another level. Massive stone structures, carved statues, and intricate altars were built not only to honor gods, but also to project the strength of the civilization itself. A temple that could be seen from miles away was a declaration. We are many, we are organized, we endure. Public rituals reinforced this unity. Seasonal festivals marked planting and harvest, calling on divine favor for abundance. Processions, dances, and sacrifices brought the community together in shared purpose and emotion. In these moments, personal identity blurred into collective identity. Everyone was part of something larger, something sacred. For rulers, religion was both a source of legitimacy and a tool of governance. Kings claimed descent from gods or divine selection to rule. Victories in battle were credited to divine favor, while natural disasters were interpreted as signs of displeasure, requiring offerings or reform. The blending of political and spiritual authority made disobedience not just a civic offense, but a sin. The construction of temples and monuments also served practical purposes. These projects provided work for laborers, drove demand for skilled craftsmen, and demonstrated the administrative power to mobilize massive resources. Even in times of hardship, leaders often pushed such works forward because a great monument outlasted its builders, cementing their legacy in stone. Through shared belief, civilizations maintained cohesion. Faith united people across class lines, justified social hierarchies, and gave meaning to the hardships of daily life. And in the shadow of their temples and monuments, early humans found both comfort and control. Their lives bound by stories and structures that shaped the world they knew. As settlements grew into cities and cities into regions, the world became more crowded. Farmland, water sources, and trade routes once abundant enough for small bands to share now became prized possessions. The stakes were higher, and with them came a new reality. Conflict was no longer an occasional skirmish over hunting grounds. It was organized, planned, and often inevitable. Early wars were rarely fought for conquest alone. Most erupted over resources. A dry season might drive one community to raid another's granaries. A blocked trade route could spark retaliation. Sometimes, war was preemptive, a strike launched to weaken a rival before they could do the same. These conflicts required coordination, training, and specialized tools, marking the birth of a warrior class. Weapons evolved alongside society. Spears and bows were refined for greater accuracy and power. Shields and armor appeared, turning the body into a fortress. The same metallurgy that produced farming tools now fed the forge of war. Battle tactics became more sophisticated. Ambushes, fortified positions, and even siege strategies began to emerge. Yet violence was only one path. Diplomacy developed in parallel, born from the understanding that constant warfare drained resources and lives. Leaders met to negotiate truces, form alliances, and arrange marriages that bound powerful families together. Treaties might guarantee safe passage for traders or establish agreed boundaries. Sometimes these agreements held, other times they were broken as soon as an opportunity arose. Religion often played a role here as well. Neutral sacred sites could serve as meeting grounds for negotiations. Oaths sworn before the gods carried weight, and breaking them risked not only political fallout but divine wrath. War and diplomacy shaped the political map. Victorious cities could demand tribute from their rivals, swelling their own resources while weakening others. Alliances could shift the balance of power, with smaller states banding together against larger threats. Over time, empires began to form vast networks of territories bound together by force, agreements, and the promise of shared prosperity. But in every case, the underlying truth was the same. In a world of growing populations and finite resources, no society could afford to live in isolation. Whether by sword or by handshake, they were all entangled in the same web of survival and ambition. As societies expanded and specialized, the goods they produced began to travel far beyond their own borders. What had once been simple exchanges between neighboring villages now stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas. Long-distance trade became the lifeline of early civilizations, bringing both wealth and influence and sometimes danger. Overland trade routes developed first, often following the paths that nomadic herders and hunters had used for centuries. Caravans formed, composed of merchants, pack animals, and guards. They carried spices, textiles, metals, precious stones, and crafted goods, along with the raw materials that fueled local industries. The caravan was more than a moving market. It was a small, traveling community that braved weather, bandits, and hostile territories to link worlds that might otherwise never meet. Meanwhile, along coasts and navigable rivers, another revolution unfolded: maritime trade. Early boats and rafts gave way to larger, sturdier ships capable of carrying heavy cargo across open water. Harbors and port cities became thriving hubs where cultures mixed, sailors speaking multiple languages, traders haggling over exotic goods, and foreign customs influencing local life. These routes carried more than material wealth. Ideas traveled with the traders, religious beliefs, artistic styles, technologies, and even political systems spread along the same paths as gold and grain. A potter in one city might adopt a design scene on imported goods from hundreds of miles away. A ruler might implement new administrative techniques learned from a visiting merchant. Long-distance trade also changed the scale of economic life. Cities that controlled strategic trade points, river, mounts, mountain passes, desert oases could grow rich and powerful, taxing goods that passed through and ensuring safe passage for a price. Rival cities fought to control these choke points, and entire wars were waged over the rights to lucrative routes. But the web of trade also created interdependence. A bad harvest in one region could ripple across others when it disrupted the flow of goods. Alliances formed to keep trade open. Rivalries flared when monopolies emerged. In this way, the prosperity of distant lands became tied together, making the ancient world more interconnected than ever before. Through caravans and ships, the horizons of early civilizations stretched wider. No society was truly alone, no each was a node in a growing network that spanned continents, carrying the threads of culture, power, and ambition across the world. The same routes that carried wealth, ideas, and opportunity also carried risk. In a world more connected than ever before, danger no longer came only from the next valley or the neighboring city. It could arrive from lands so distant their names were barely known. One of the most insidious threats was disease. Traders, sailors, and caravans brought with them not just exotic goods, but invisible passengers, viruses and bacteria for which local populations had no immunity. A sickness born in one bustling port could, within weeks, spread along trade routes, devastating cities that had never seen the original source. Entire regions could be weakened, their armies thinned, their fields left untended as illness claimed the strong and the vulnerable alike. Economic shocks followed a similar pattern. A failed harvest in one major trading center could disrupt the supply of staple goods, driving up prices across the network. Merchants might hoard what they had, further inflating costs and sowing unrest. Cities that relied heavily on imported food or materials could face sudden famine or collapse when those lifelines were cut. Cultural exchange, while often enriching, also sparked conflict. Ideas, religions, and customs brought by travelers could challenge established traditions. In some places, foreign influence was embraced, new art styles flourished, technologies spread, and cuisines blended. In others, these changes provoked resistance. Religious leaders might condemn outside beliefs as heresy. Rulers might ban foreign goods, and entire communities could turn hostile toward outsiders. The spread of new technologies could also upset the balance of power. A weapon design traded to one city could quickly make its army superior to its rivals. Innovations in shipbuilding, agriculture, or fortifications often gave the advantage to those who adopted them first, leaving others scrambling to catch up. Poor-risk conquest. The interconnectedness of the ancient world was a double-edged sword. It offered prosperity and progress, but also made civilizations vulnerable to shocks beyond their control. No city, however powerful, was immune to the ripple effects of distant events. In this fragile balance between benefit and risk, the ancient world learned a lesson that still holds true today. Connection is power, but it is also exposure. As cities grew larger and trade connected distant lands, daily life became more complex, and with complexity came conflict. Disputes over land, debts, contracts, and personal grievances could no longer be settled solely by tradition or the judgment of a respected elder. Larger populations needed consistency, a set of rules that everyone could recognize and follow. The earliest laws were spoken, passed from memory by leaders, priests, or council elders. They carried the weight of tradition, but their flexibility could also be their flaw. Decisions might vary depending on who was in charge. Over time, rulers recognized the need to make these rules permanent, visible, and unchangeable without consensus or authority. Thus was born the written code. Some of the most famous examples, like the Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, carved laws into stone for all to see. These laws covered every aspect of life: property rights, trade agreements, marriage contracts, criminal punishments. The message was clear: justice was no longer arbitrary. It was set in writing, and ignorance of the law was no excuse. Law served more than justice, it served power. A ruler who could claim to enforce fairness was more likely to keep loyalty, while laws that favored certain classes could entrench social hierarchies. Punishments were often harsh, meant to deter wrongdoing and demonstrate authority. In many cases, the severity of a crime's penalty depended on the social status of both victim and offender, revealing that equality under the law was still a distant dream. Religion often underpinned these systems. Laws might be framed as divinely inspired, with gods depicted as granting justice to kings. Breaking the law could thus be seen as both a civic offense and a spiritual sin, reinforcing obedience through fear of both earthly and divine consequences. Public display of the law was itself a statement. A stone stele standing in a marketplace was a daily reminder that order was not just maintained by the threat of force, but by a shared understanding of what was right and wrong, at least as defined by those in power. The written code became one of civilization's most enduring tools. It made possible the governance of large, diverse populations, allowed strangers to trade with trust, and created a framework that could outlast individual rulers. In the ancient world, law was more than a set of rules, it was the foundation on which complex societies stood. In the earliest days of settlement, paths were little more than worn tracks between fields and rivers. But as cities expanded and trade networks stretched farther, the need for reliable infrastructure became impossible to ignore. Roads, aqueducts, and storage facilities were not luxuries, they were the arteries that kept the body of civilization alive. Roads connected villages to towns, towns to cities, and cities to distant markets. At first, these were simple dirt tracks, but over time they became engineered works of stone and gravel, designed to withstand heavy traffic and seasonal rains. Well-built roads allowed armies to move swiftly in times of war, merchants to travel safely with their goods, and messengers to carry orders and news across vast territories in days instead of weeks. A ruler who commanded the roads commanded the realm. Water management was equally transformative. Aqueducts and canals brought fresh water into cities and irrigated farmland, turning otherwise barren lands into productive fields. Reservoirs stored water for dry seasons, reducing the constant fear of drought. In some civilizations, complex sewer systems emerged, carrying waste away from densely populated areas, a leap forward in public health that allowed cities to grow without being choked by their own refuse. Storage infrastructure tied it all together. Granaries protected surplus harvests from pests and weather, ensuring a steady food supply even in lean years. These reserves could feed workers building monumental projects, sustain armies during campaigns, or support the population through a bad harvest. Whoever controlled the granaries controlled the survival of the people. Such public works required immense organization, laborers, architects, engineers, and administrators working in concert. They were proof of a society's ability to plan for the future, to invest resources in something that might take years to complete but would serve generations. Yet infrastructure was also a tool of control. Roads could be used to move troops as easily as goods. Aqueducts could be diverted to punish rebellious regions. Granaries could distribute or withhold food depending on loyalty to the ruling power. Still, the benefits were undeniable. Infrastructure didn't just connect places, it connected people, enabling commerce, communication, and cooperation on a scale impossible in earlier ages. In the dust of the roads, the shadows of aqueducts, and the cool dark of the granaries, the foundations of civilization were laid in stone and water, with the essentials of survival increasingly secured through farming, trade, and infrastructure. Human creativity found new space to grow. For the first time in history, significant portions of the population could devote themselves not solely to feeding the community or defending it, but to exploring beauty, knowledge, and the mysteries of the world. Art flourished in many forms. Walls of temples and palaces became canvases for vivid frescoes depicting gods, rulers, battles, and scenes of daily life. Sculptors carved stone and cast bronze into works that honored leaders, celebrated victories, or captured the human form with remarkable realism. Music moved from the simple rhythms of early life to complex compositions played on stringed instruments, flutes, and drums, accompanying rituals, celebrations, and even moments of mourning. Science, though not yet defined, as we know it, was driven by curiosity and necessity. Farmers studied the movement of the sun and stars to better predict planting seasons. Healers experimented with herbs and minerals, learning which combinations could soothe pain or heal wounds. Builders developed advanced mathematics to construct more ambitious structures, from towering ziggurats to perfectly proportioned columns. Astronomers tracked celestial patterns, not only for agriculture but to weave into religious and cultural life. Knowledge began to accumulate, passed from one generation to the next, refined and expanded. Schools and scribal traditions emerged, training a class of scholars who preserved records, copied texts, and developed systems of writing for increasingly complex ideas. Libraries small at first became repositories of collective human experience, holding everything from trade ledgers to poetry. The arts and sciences often intertwined. Advances in metallurgy enabled more intricate jewelry and stronger building materials. New pigments expanded the palette of painters. Mathematical principles were used to compose music and design harmonious architecture in many civilizations. The pursuit of beauty and the pursuit of knowledge were seen as two parts of the same quest for order and meaning. For the ruling elite, patronage of the arts and sciences was a statement of power and prestige. A magnificent temple, a well-planned city, or a calendar that predicted eclipses could all reinforce a leader's authority and inspire awe among subjects and rivals alike. In this environment, humanity's imagination stretched farther than ever before. The foundations laid by labor and law now supported the soaring achievements of creativity and intellect, proof that civilization was not only about survival, but about leaving a legacy that could outlast the builders themselves. The arts, sciences, laws, and infrastructure of early civilizations did more than serve practical needs. They shaped how people saw themselves. A city was not just a cluster of buildings. It was a living symbol of shared identity, bound together by common stories, rituals, and achievements. Public monuments and temples told citizens that they were part of something grand and enduring. Festivals and religious ceremonies reminded them of a shared heritage. Written laws gave them a sense of order and justice, however imperfect, that distinguished their society from the chaos beyond its borders. Trade connected them to distant lands, while art and literature told them who they were in relation to the wider world. In this way, civilizations cultivated a sense of belonging that could inspire loyalty, sacrifice, and ambition. People worked not only for themselves or their families, but for the prosperity and honor of their city, their kingdom, or their empire. But the same forces that built these identities could also be their undoing. Pride could harden into arrogance, leading to overreach in war or neglect at home. Rigid traditions could stifle innovation. Economic dependence on distant trade routes could make a city vulnerable to collapse if those routes failed. Disease, disaster, or political upheaval could undo centuries of progress in a single generation. And yet, even when civilizations fell, they left behind traces, ruins, writings, art that spoke of their ambitions and their achievements. These remnants became the seeds for new societies, carrying forward ideas, technologies, and cultural values into the future. The story of early civilization is not one of steady ascent, but of cycles: growth, flourishing, decline, and rebirth. Each society added its voice to the human chorus, shaping the long arc of history in ways both deliberate and unintended. When we look back at these first great centers of human life, we see not just the foundations of our modern world, but the blueprint of human nature itself. Our drive to create, to organize, to connect, and to endure. And just as their monuments once cast long shadows in the sun, their influence still stretches across the ages, reminding us that civilization is both our greatest achievement and our most fragile inheritance.